Good morning, everyone. We are just going to give it another minute or so just to allow a little bit more time for our members to join, and then we will commence this morning's webinar. Okay, so good morning, everyone, and you're very welcome to ARC Workplace Risks webinar this morning, where we're going to be breaking down and discussing in detail fire risk assessments, in particular British Standard 9792. And it's wonderful to see so many attendees this morning, some familiar faces as well, and well-known companies on the call, as well as service providers in the industry, which I've no doubt will be utilising today's session as a learning tool to go forward in the industry. So to commence, I will just give a bit of a background on ARC Workplace Risk, who we are and what we're about. So within ARC, we very much have a proven track record in terms of empowering our clients to confidently manage risk, compliance and safety. And we build a true partnership based on innovation and expertise. We have over 30 years industry experience to date, and we very much serve as an extension of your team. We deliver tailored solutions that protect your people, your properties, and operations in order for you to have that complete peace of mind in your buildings and navigating today's environment. Our approach within ARC Workplace Risk, we combine the industry's top consultants and we utilize our intuitive CUDA platform that simplifies your compliance management, which inevitably will save time and allow you to focus on your critical tasks. So beyond day to day, we guide you through our complex and contentious critical solutions and situations with confidence. And we can provide the tools, the insights, and everything that's needed for you to make those informed decisions in any scenario. So thank you for joining us today. So I will also go through the agenda just before we kick off. So we're going to go through an overall induction and introduction to what this is about, and we'll talk a bit on the historic trajectory we've had to get here, in particular the Grenfell Tower inquiry and the Grenfell Tower report. We're going to break down new requirements and demystify what is required here. We will discuss Section 156 of the Building Safety Act as well. We'll also navigate through what are the key changes here, what are the new pillars of FRAs, and this is where we'll really deep dive into BS 972, which is our new British standard, which is for fire risk assessment and housing code of practice. We'll also go through the types of fire risk assessment, the 4 types of risk assessment that there is and what each involves and how they're adapted to our buildings. We'll also look in particular on the actual principles of fire risk assessment and what the 9-step approach that's been created really means and how it navigates through the fire risk assessment principle. We will go through person-centered fire risk assessments as well. This will be coming live next year in April, and why this is being introduced and the requirements of it and why this really is a critical approach and what comes from the Fire Safety Resident Evacuation Plans England Regulations 2025. We'll go through competence. In particular, we're going to go through British Standard 8674, which is the competency framework that's been introduced and what this looks like. We'll conclude at the end, and as always, we will allow time for Q&A at the end. So we do have a chat function, so please feel free to pop in your questions through the chat function as we go through today's webinar, and we will endeavour to ensure we can get them answered at the end of the session. So I will now hand you over to David Hills, who will be demystifying today's session and going through today's webinar in detail. So over to you, David.
Thank you, Tara. Name is David Hills. I am Senior Director here at ARC. I've been with ARC for over 25 years. I've worked on a number of requirements in respect of things such as the Regulatory Reform Fire Safety Order, as well as on the Building Safety Act. So as Tara suggested, we're going to start off with a brief introduction and have a look at why have we got this new standard BS 9792. The first thing is that the Grenfell Tower inquiry report during its phase one approach made it very, very clear that there was or had been a failure in the guidance that was available at the time, which was called PAS 79.2. It failed to adequately address, according to Sir Martin Moore-Bick, the needs and requirements of the occupants. In his opinion and in the panel's opinion, it stated wrongly that there was not a practical way of identifying and providing for vulnerable persons. We have to remember that a significant number of people who died within the Grenfell Tower fire were actually those who were considered to be vulnerable persons. There was, for example, criticism about the historic approach to very limited visual inspections of buildings. And generally, what the panel suggested was effectively that the industry was not dealing with fire risk assessments and fire safety sufficiently. They didn't feel that they were thorough enough. And in addition to that, there were some significant concerns relating to competence of fire risk assessors. Now, that actually came out in October 2019. So at that time, there were, as I said, severe criticisms of PAS 79.2. PAS 79.2 was then withdrawn by the BSI early in 2021. And they were due to therefore provide a new guide, a new PAS, a new British standard, and they were due to actually have that out in 2024. But the introduction of Section 156 of the Building Safety Act in October 2023 really meant that the BSI had to go back and rethink about how they were looking at fire risk assessments. So what did Section 156 actually require then that meant that there was perhaps a need for that additional review? Well, Section 156 of the Building Safety Act, I think most people believe that the Building Safety Act only applies to residential buildings. It doesn't. Section 156 actually amended the Regulatory Reform Fire Safety Order. I'm going to call that the Fire Safety Order from now on, which covers England and Wales. And those changes actually occurred on the 1st of October 2023, and it basically affects all types of buildings and all workplaces covered by the fire safety order. That is residential. That's made it very clear residential is included, but as well as commercial, retail, industrial, and any other type of workplace as well. The overall aim of Section 156 was very, very clear. It really looked to enhance fire safety risk assessments, as well as focus on the competency side as well. The section is encouraging people to actually have more comprehensive and much more detailed fire risk assessments, and effectively requires local fire authorities to require that and insist on that, with also improved cooperation and coordination and communication between all the parties responsible for a building. When a fire actually attacks a building, it's not just going to stay in one area. There is a likelihood that it's going to spread from one part of a building to another, especially if compartmentation has broken down. But we also have to recognize that compartmentation is only there to inhibit the spread of fire, and it's only going to do that for a set period of time. So the overall aim of Section 156, as I said, is to improve and understand the fact that there is often going to be more than one party involved within a particular building. And the final section in respect of 156 is to improve competence of fire risk assessors. And again, I'm going to go through a new standard, BS 8674, later on in the presentation, which is again another British standard that has come out that's looking at Section 156. And in fact, we are due to hear in the next couple of months from the government on how they intend to look at competence of fire risk assessors across the whole of the UK. So Section 156 has had a major impact on the fire safety order. Now, the fire safety order itself makes it very clear and requires that a fire risk assessment undertaken for whatever building must be suitable and sufficient. Now, the big problem we have is that there is no definitive term for what suitable and sufficient actually means. And in fact, in the actual fire safety order, there is no definition at all. What we have, though, is guidance that's been issued by both the HSC and the Building Safety Regulator. And in addition to that, we've got some sketchy guidance from the Chief Fire Officers Association. And they basically have suggested that there are certain things we need to look at in order to satisfy that suitability and sufficiency test. For example, does the assessment actually have sufficient coverage? Is it a full and proper check of the whole building? Because again, fires don't necessarily stay in one particular area. Does it provide, for example, full and detailed justification, including commentary? So the days of tick box exercise only, it's okay to have a tick box, but if you've got a tick box with no commentary and no justification on the acceptance or not of any fire safety measures that it's referring to, then that is unlikely going to be considered to be acceptable going forward. In addition to that, we've got to make sure that we provide full technical consideration. What does that mean? Well, the technical consideration they're talking about is making sure that we look at all of the fire safety systems within a building. Is the building sprinklered? Is it partially sprinkled in areas that are perhaps not under your control? What type of fire alarm, what type of detection system is within the system? Do we have smoke ventilation in key areas or some areas or the whole building? So we need to look at the technical consideration of all of the measures that are in place. We also need to make sure that we consider all of those people who may be affected by the risks. And when in respect of that, consider all of the risks, taking into consideration the numbers of people who may be affected. Now, that last one really comes again from Section 156. Prior to October 2023, a fire risk assessment only had to identify the significant risks. Section 156 effectively removes that and says, no, sorry, that's not acceptable. We now need to look at all of the fire-related risks. So again, a much more comprehensive, robust process to fire risk assessments. In addition to that suitability and sufficiency test, Section 156 also amended the fire safety order, and it requires that responsible persons, and responsible persons here we are talking about property managers, other responsible persons, for example, within the building could be commercial tenants. So commercial tenants are considered to be responsible persons. And so what Section 156 requires that within your fire risk assessment, you have got to take reasonable and reasonably practicable steps to ascertain the existence of what they call responsible persons who share or have duties in respect of the same premises, as well as identifying any accountable persons under the Building Safety Act. So we can't just look at that particular part and turn around and say, okay, well, we just got to ignore the fact that we've got a commercial operator perhaps on the ground floor. No, we've got to consider that. I think the difficulty that Section 156 gave us was the fact that we don't just have to identify the existence of that person, we've also got to identify a UK address. Now, that is causing some issues for many. But it's certainly something that needs to be considered. We need to find out where, for example, notices can be served, both in respect of private legal action and obviously legal action undertaken by the Fire and Rescue Service. In addition, responsible persons have got to share relevant information with the incoming responsible persons. So what we mean by that is that if, for example, you are taking over a property, an existing property from another managing agent, that managing agent now has to provide you with all of the information they have relating to that building, the previous fire risk assessments, any fire strategy, the as-built fire plans that are required in law, details of the maintenance tests that have been undertaken. All of that type of information has to be shared with the incoming responsible person. And that extends down to the commercial operators as well. So it's not just property managers that have to look at that, but commercial operators as well. Again, additionally to all of this, Section 156 has said amended the fire safety order, and it requires that as a responsible person, property managers have got to be providing residents with relevant fire safety information, but in a format that is easily understood by the residents. And again, that again is another requirement. There's some secondary legislation as well called the Fire Safety England Regulations of 2022. And finally, in respect to Section 156, in HRBs, so any building that's 18 metres or 7 stories or more that contains 2 or more residential apartments, and this obviously is in England only, they must provide a summary of the findings of the fire risk assessment, again, in a format that is easily understood by residents. And again, that comes as well, not only through Section 156, but in respect of secondary legislation from the what they call the Higher Risks Keeping and Provision of Information England Regulations 2024. So Section 156 has had a big impact, and you can see therefore why the British Standards Institute decided actually it was really important that we understood how Section 156 was going to be implemented before they produced the new guide to replace PAS 79.2. So let's look at the new guide then. So the new British standard that replaces PAS 79 is British Standard 9792, and it came out about in September this year. It applies to houses in multiple occupation, HMOs. It applies to blocks of flats and maisonettes, both purpose-built and converted. It applies to specialised housing, such as supported or sheltered accommodation. It obviously applies to purpose-built student accommodation and any other student accommodation that fits the other definitions. And also, in addition to that, it covers the common areas where you have mixed-use buildings that obviously provide access to residential premises. What the new code does not, though, apply to is private single household dwellings, short-term lets and care homes, as well as non-domestic premises as well. So the new standard is out there. It applies to those particular areas. So what actually does it require, and what does it actually provide for? Well, the guide is actually a very the actual standard, sorry, provides a significant amount of guidance and actually provides to ensure that any new fire risk assessment, again, for a residential block or in any type of housing other than those that I mentioned, the actual assessment is far more robust and actually much clearer in its determination. It provides for stronger requirements for how you justify the suitability or not of the fire safety systems that you have in place, and again enforces and makes sure that fire risk assessors actually provide you with evidence. It also focused very heavily on ensuring that you've got the right available documentation, as well as I said, providing much stronger guidance on the acceptability of evacuation strategies, be that stay put, phased evacuation, or simultaneous evacuations. It does reflect on current legislation, but it also then places a stronger emphasis on inclusivity. It looks at, for example, vulnerable persons. It looks to make sure that we are really focusing on legal compliance, and it does look to see and consider modern practices in residential management that have come out of the Building Safety Act and other pieces of legislation, such as the increase in resident engagement. So we can see that the British Standard itself is quite a significant document. It's a really important document because this is the document that your fire risk assessments are now going to be measured against, not only by the regulator, but also by local fire and rescue services. And we are already seeing local fire and rescue services refer to this British Standard and saying it doesn't meet the existing risk assessments for some people, because they were undertaken 5, 6, 7 months ago. Actually, it doesn't meet the new guidance, and they are using that to actually enforce fire safety improvements within buildings, and we're seeing that across many areas of England, and some areas as well in Wales and Scotland. So what are the new pillars then? What is it that we've got to do? What have we got to change from the old approach to fire risk assessment to actually meeting the requirements of BS 9792? Well, we like to call them the 5 pillars, because if we can break it down and look at each particular area, we can therefore make sure that our fire risk assessments for properties that include housing, so residential blocks, converted or not, purpose-built student accommodation, etc., actually meet the requirements. And the first thing we've got to do is consider justification. Have we provided sufficient commentary and assessment of the acceptance or not of all of the fire safety measures that you have in place? And in addition, have we provided the available evidence to prove it? So it's not just a case of, yep, okay, a fire alarm system is in place. Well, why? Why is the fire alarm system there? What is it doing? Is it acceptable? Does it meet a particular code? And what evidence have we got to prove that? So that justification piece is very key. We've also got to make sure that we've got sufficient coverage. So a proper check of all the areas affected, including those areas that may be under the control of others. We've also got to then, as I said earlier, have that technical consideration, consider all of the areas of fire safety systems that apply, both active systems as well as passive as well. And as the code talks about this, it really focuses our attention back to Dame Judith Hackett's approach, which is that we should be looking at buildings as a system, a collection of what she called connected, protective controls, measures and layers. And then finally, we've got to make sure that the person who's actually undertaking that fire risk assessment for you is competent to do so. So do they have the skills, the knowledge, the experience and the behaviours to deliver the required outcomes? So let's go back to justification then very quickly. You may have seen sometimes in risk assessments, people have ticked a box and turned around and said, the property has a fire alarm system. That's not going to be acceptable. We're going to now need to start looking at what type of category it is. Is it an alarm system? Is it a detection system? What is it doing? What is it there to design to do? Where is it located? What type of system? The who, the what, the why, the where. That is what the regulator will be looking for. That is what fire and rescue services will be looking for, and this will therefore meet the requirements of both Section 156 and the fire safety order itself. Okay, let's look very quickly then at the 4 types of fire risk assessment. Most people know about them, but let's just reiterate them because they have been redefined within the new British standard. We're going to be looking typically at common areas only and non-intrusive, which is a typical type 1. That's the minimum requirement for a submission under the regulatory reform fire safety order, the fire safety order requirements. So that's going to be looking at by the fire and rescue services. But again, minimum standards. And we're already seeing, as I said, fire and rescue services effectively saying, nope, it's insufficient. We've got other areas, we've got areas of concern that need to be considered. So the other 3 types need to therefore be thought about. So a type 2 will look at the common areas only, but it'll be more intrusive. So why would someone want an intrusive survey? Well, it could be that last year your type 1 assessment actually highlighted significant failures or flaws that could compromise, for example, fire compartmentation. That type 2 assessment is much more intrusive. It looks to consider those structural fire protection and other vulnerabilities and to confirm how well is the building doing in respect of stopping fire from both spreading and actually moving around the building or moving in those particular areas for which we are responsible for. Type 3 risk assessments are much more deeper. They look at the common areas as well as a sample of dwellings on a non-intrusive basis. It, as I said, provides that deeper understanding of fire safety within the building. It supports justification. It will support your building safety case, for example. And it's very, very relevant for landlords who are purchasing a property and or for properties where you have vulnerable tenants. And the final one is a type 4 fire risk assessment, which looks at common areas and a sample of dwellings, but includes some degree of intrusive and destructive survey. When would someone want this particular one? Well, when serious unaddressed fire safety defects in both common areas and or individual apartments have been identified, you would probably go for a type 4. You would also, for example, consider a type 4 if you were particularly concerned or had suspicions about the construction history of that particular building, or where there was a high risk of fire spread and there was a need for a much deeper in-depth inspection of compartmentation and fire stopping. So 4 levels that haven't really changed very much, some slight changes to definition, but the coverage element now is really important. We really do need to think about what one is appropriate for your particular building and for your particular circumstances. We can't just turn around and say, oh, well, I'm only responsible for the common areas of the building, so I'm only going to do a type 1. If we need to consider this on a whole building basis, we need then to actually start thinking about whether it's type 2, 3 or 4 that's more appropriate. And again, justification of that needs to be included within the assessment. Justification of why you have only focused on the areas that you have done has to be included within your fire risk assessment. Now, the British Standard sets out some key principles for fire risk assessments, which wasn't actually included within the previous PAS. So the first thing it talks about is that actually fire risk assessments, and it follows from the definition of fire risk itself, that a fire risk assessment involves consideration of all of your fire hazards and the means for their elimination and control. So what type of fire prevention measures are in place? So one of the key principles is to actually ensure that we look to the methodologies, the systems and the management arrangements that are in place to either eliminate the fire risk or to control it adequately. And it sets out some key areas in respect of a hierarchy of control. One of the things as well, one of the principles that it talks about is that the objective of fire risk assessment cannot be limited merely to preventing harm to the people within that building as a result of a particular hazard. But it also then talks about looking at what endeavours are being made to eliminate or reduce the hazards actually themselves. So it's not just about the people, it's about what we are doing in order to, again, eliminate or reduce fire risk basically on a basic basis. And it's really then about how we can also then reduce the likelihood of fire. So it's also about fire prevention. So we will be looking at management arrangements. I think what is also very important is that the guidance makes it very clear that the likelihood of a fire cannot be reduced to zero. Fires will occur. So we've got to accept that. And the fire risk assessor has got to look at that as well. But it also, again, it means that we've then got to look at all of the fire protection measures in place, the protection of the means of escape, the measures that actually assist in using those means of escape routes, such as passive active systems, such as ventilation, the means of giving warning in the event of a fire, the means of actually fighting that fire, as well as structural fire precautions as well. Now, the principles also then talk about the fact that many buildings in the UK have been designed around a fire engineering approach. And what they've made very clear is that whilst it's necessary to verify that a fire risk engineered building meets the new strategy, we're not there to check the design from first principles. We're not there as an assessor to check the calculations. We're there to actually make sure that what's been agreed within the strategy is actually in place. Is it there? Is it properly managed? Is it properly maintained? In addition, the guidance says it's very clear that fire risk assessors should not be undertaking intrusive investigations in respect of structural fire precautions or structural fire protection. So they're not expecting people to open up the structure and remove sections of ceilings. There are other methods of intrusivity in respect of the types 2 and the type 4 assessments that need to be considered. So structural fire protection, the protection around the beams and the columns, that is going to have to be accepted following construction unless there is evidence to prove that there are problems. It's also expected that fire risk assessors will not be testing the active systems. We will not be setting off fire alarms or testing smoke extraction systems. And finally, the final principle contained within the actual code is that every fire risk assessor, every fire risk assessment must include a thorough consideration of the fire safety management arrangements that are in place. So they are the key principles. So British Standard 9792, as I said, it's a detailed document. There's some significant guidance in there in respect of all of this, but those key principles are very, very important. Don't expect your fire risk assessor to be testing your fire alarm system. Don't expect your fire risk assessor to be testing and checking the calculations from a fire strategy, but they do need a copy of the fire strategy if there is one in place. So what is the new 9-step approach that the code actually says? And I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but the first thing we've got to do is to obtain relevant information. So there is going to be a need for a document trawl. What information is held in respect of the fire safety arrangements within that particular building? It will be then upon the assessor to identify what fire hazards are in place and determine what are the existing measures of control. What systems do we already have in place? What inspections are being undertaken? What measures do we have in place to manage fire safety? And from that, make that initial subjective assessment of the likelihood of a fire actually materializing. And we've got to base that upon step 1 and step 2. We've then got to look at the physical fire protection measures that are in place and determine your fire safety management arrangements, what documentation and evidence is available. And again, then make that subjective assessment of the consequences of fire. And again, based on step 1, step 4, and step 5. What we then do is we then take effectively step 3 and step 6 and combine them for a final assessment of risk. If, for example, though, there are issues that need to be taken, there are new controls in place or controls need to be amended, then you have got to develop a prioritized management action plan to address all of the shortcomings and reduce the risk. And finally, under BS 9792, there is a need to determine the frequency for review. So again, it's not just a case of, okay, there's our risk assessment, but when should we then be looking at reviewing the frequency? If we were to use this, for example, in Wales, under the new proposed guidelines in Wales, I can tell you straight away that the frequency will be annual because that is going to be a legal requirement in Wales if the law goes through as it is proposed at the moment. So that 9-step approach is slightly different to the previous 5-step approach that the HSC and PAS 79.2 included. It doesn't really change much for yourselves. It just means that we have to ensure that we are following very detailed processes on how we capture, gather information and use that information. Now, when it talks about the subjective assessment of the risk, that final assessment of risk, excuse me, the guide, the standard actually sets out some very, very clear processes and again provides for a very simple 3x3 matrix on how we should be looking at risk, whether we are considering the harm or considering the actual likelihood, whether it's unlikely or very likely, then that's where we have to look at. And again, the standard sets that out. It also states very clearly that we need a methodology for determining or defining that particular risk, and that needs to be very transparent. So there needs to be within the fire risk assessment a very clear understanding, that very clear matrix, as a very transparent way of dealing with it. And just as an example, I've just put up ARC's version there that you will find within our fire risk assessments, which by the way do meet 9792, and where we actually talk about the different levels of risk, the result, and very importantly, a definition of what measures should be undertaken and a proposed timeline as well. Again, a very transparent approach, which is what the standard is looking for. So that's the basis of fire risk assessments and the changes within the standard. They are significant. It does mean that existing approaches need to be reviewed, and you're going to have to be able to prove that in many instances if fire and rescue services are ever involved within your buildings. But there is an additional element to the actual standard that's very important to consider, and that is vulnerable persons. And I don't want to spend too much time on this because we have already done a presentation on this, but basically under the fire safety residential evacuation plans, England regulations, this applies to relevant residents, and that's a permanent resident of a specified building whose ability to evacuate the building without assistance is effectively impaired because of either a cognitive, physical impairment or condition. And it requires that within that you undertake what's called a person-centered fire risk assessment, which leads ultimately to a personal emergency egress statement. Now, the beauty about the new standard, BS 9792, is that it sets out that approach. So we can now plan for when this new requirement comes into force, which is April next year, April the 6th. So the definition of a resident is up on the screen there. So I don't intend to go too much into that. And obviously it applies to any type of building that's 18 meters or 7 stories above, as well as any building that is 11 meters or above that has a simultaneous evacuation strategy. And effectively, the definition within BS 9792 of vulnerabilities is based around all of these definitions. It's not just the mobility impaired. We could, for example, be morbidly obese, sensory and neurological issues. In addition to that, temporary impairment as well, and pregnancy is also included as a vulnerable person. And so the approach within that means that we've got to start looking at the process within a person's home. So we have to look at the very specific fire hazards in their home and identify specific arrangements, as well as areas outside of that, the means of escape arrangements as well. And we've got to identify why a person is actually undertaking it. And actually, it can be called in from many different sources, whether it's the residents themselves, it could be carers who are acting on their behalf, it could be family members who ask you to undertake it, or you as a landlord or as an agency just feel that it's actually appropriate, and as part of your engagement process, you've identified that a particular person is a vulnerable person. And effectively, you've got to assess that the fire safety risks, again, inside the residents' domestic premises themselves, assess the fire safety risks within the common parts, and consider how good and what's the residents' ability to evacuate the building in the event of a fire. I think the important part as well is that we've got to ensure that the outcomes of any person-centered fire risk assessment are considered alongside all of the other arrangements within your normal fire risk assessment. Just as an aside, BS 9792 provides a complete suggested approach on how this can be undertaken. I want to finish then on the last part in respect of competence. Just touch very quickly on the new British standard BS 8674. It's all about a framework for competence for fire risk assessors. It sets out very clearly a framework for assessing the competence of individuals as well as businesses as well, and it provides performance-based criteria that could be used. So one of the areas that we would strongly recommend is that you should be asking, not only is your new risk assessment to BS 9792, but are the actual assessors competent to deliver that particular part? And what the code does, it provides for, again, that framework for non-invasive fire risk assessments. It provides guidance on what records and historical documentation they should be looking at. And very importantly, it sets out a 3-tier approach to assessing someone's competence. So if we're talking about foundation, it's, for example, they are able to actually undertake simple, low-risk buildings with minimal occupancy. If, for example, they are intermediately assessed, then they're suitable for buildings of moderate complexity and broader usage types. And then the more advanced assessor would be attended for high-risk buildings, complex environments such as very large residential blocks, care facilities, and public entertainment venues. So I just really want to finish by looking at the practical implications for property managers. One of the things that we would strongly recommend you look at is make sure that your assessors are using BS 9792. Make sure that you've selected the right coverage. Is your building a high-risk building? Has it a history of compartmentation or other issues? If it is, perhaps type 1 is not the right approach that you will be looking for. But be prepared that if you do go down the type 1 approach, then that may get called into question by either the regulator or the fire and rescue service. You should verify your fire risk assessor's competence. You should be looking as well at the organisation. Does the organisation have what we call organisational capability to manage competence? We would strongly recommend that you plan for April 2026. Set up a programme now for person-centred fire risk assessments. Ask your residents about their needs and requirements as part of your resident engagement if you're a high-risk building. But if your building is 11 metres or above, then again, strongly recommend that we ask residents about their needs and requirements. Make sure that you support the fire risk assessor by having available that golden thread of information. And make sure that if you receive a fire risk assessor or fire risk assessment, that tells you that you've got actions to undertake, that you systematically prioritize those and complete those remedial works and actions promptly. So key takeaways then: strengthened legislation. Section 156 has had and will have a significant impact on fire risk assessments in all types of buildings, not just residential. It does amend the fire safety order and it demands more robust, detailed and coordinated fire risk assessments. We've got that new British standard, BS 9792. It provides much clearer advice. It looks for much clearer evidence-based fire risk assessments, especially within residential settings. We've got the 4 types of risk assessment that have been very clearly defined, and therefore we need to actually make sure we can get and select the right coverage of the assessment for your building. We have that structured 9-step approach. It means that we look to provide transparent, risk-based justifications, not just tick boxes alone. We have to have, it's not a problem if someone's got a tick box, that's great. But does that tick box then actually tell you why it is acceptable, why it is okay? What is the evidence to prove that it's okay to turn around and say, yep, that box is ticked? We've got to think about person-centered fire risk assessments. April 2026 will come around pretty soon, so we would strongly recommend that you plan for it now. And again, competence-wise, that new competency framework, BS 8674, sets out the new requirements. It ensures that you get the right assessor to deliver the right quality and that they've got the right skills, the knowledge, the experience and the behaviours in order to deliver the right assessment for your building. We would strongly recommend that we start looking at resident communication. We've got to start thinking about how we share fire safety information and fire risk assessment summaries to residents, what type of language is used, and also look at the practical actions about what you need to do. It's a system in place now. Start working on it now. As I said, April, in respect of person-centered FRAs, it will come around very soon. But actually, you need to ask yourself some very simple questions. Based on the new law, based on the new code, would you be happy to stand up in front of a judge or, hopefully never, a coroner and turn around and say, look, I believe my risk assessment is suitable and sufficient? Does it provide the level of protection that you need as managers and owners? If not, we would strongly recommend that you review and don't delay. Hopefully we've got some time for some questions, so back over to you, Tara.
Great, thank you for that, David. So we've had a very successful webinar this morning. We've had just over 600 people register to be a part of this. So for ease, typically when we complete a webinar at ARC, we get a big influx of correspondences and queries. So for ease, I've added a QR code there should you wish to reach out to the ARC team so that we can help support and further discuss your requirements when we look at this new standard 9792. So please utilise the QR code there and the ARC team will be delighted to take the conversation further with you. So we've had a lot of questions come through, David, as expected. So I'm going to start off. We've had a lot of questions in regard to the classifications of the different types of fire risk assessment. So it's appearing that on the call, we've had a lot of members that are responsible for HRBs, and it seems that they have always completed type 1 fire risk assessments for their buildings, varying age buildings from what I see from the chat. The query now is, should they be expected to do it now, a review of their fire risk assessments and look to see should they actually be looking to do type 3s or potentially type 4s, or should their fire risk assessment or competent person be telling them the level of risk assessment they should be doing for their building?
Okay, the answer actually is quite simple, both. I would strongly recommend, and ARC would strongly recommend, and effectively the law requires you to ensure that your fire risk assessment is not a once only, once done thing put on the side and allowed to gather dust. Fire risk assessments are living and breathing documents. Fire risks change, technology changes. We all know that there is an increase in the use of lithium-ion batteries, for example. We've got people who are using scooters and charging scooters within their flats. We've got a whole host of different new technologies that are in place. There is a need, therefore, for us to review our fire risk assessments, not only because we've now got new guidance and new legal requirements, but because, as I say, new technologies change, we could have other changes within the building as well. So we would strongly recommend that it's an ideal time now to review, just to make sure that your fire risk assessment actually delivers that suitability and sufficiency test. If at any stage, though, you're concerned, you should go back to the fire risk assessor and seek their advice. But we would again strongly recommend that you again check to make sure that they are competent to deliver. So ask questions. We've asked you to actually ask questions to us today. We would strongly recommend that you ask questions of your assessor. Many of our clients already have asked us about our competency. We encourage that. So look at that particular part. Ultimately, though, review, but also ask your assessor, do you think this needs to be reviewed? And they will then, and ask them to justify the reasons why. I hope that's answered the question.
Great. Thanks for that, David. And just kind of touching on that in terms of fire risk assessments and the requirements for our different types of buildings that we have. We've had a lot of questions then in regards to your discussion on competency and the competency framework and what's needed. And I've grouped the questions together because it follows a very similar theme, that there's a concern and kind of, I suppose, a want to ensure that we're getting this right. So tips that you could directly advise on in how can we, as responsible persons for our buildings, ensure that we are getting the right people to support us and manage our buildings in terms of fire risk? Have you any advice that you can provide in order to ensure that we're ticking the right things when we're hiring people to look after our building?
Yep. First things first, ask questions. As I said, ask questions and ask the assessors to prove not only that they have the right qualifications, but they have the right skills, knowledge, experience. So asking questions about their experience. It's very difficult to ask them about their behaviours, but you'll be able to see that as you go through the process. So ask questions. Look for organisations that are part of a third-party scheme. Look for assessors who are part of a third-party scheme. Those third-party schemes mean and require, for example, if you're BAFE SP205 certified, then you would be receiving an annual review, an annual audit by a third party to make sure that your systems are in place and to make sure that the people have been checked and are checked on a regular basis. You can also look for and to make sure that staff or individuals are members of things such as the institute's schemes that are in place, find out whether they are and what level of assessor they are actually at. So look at those schemes, look at BAFE and others as well, but ask questions, because at the end of the day, you will then be able to turn around and say to anybody, look, well, I asked the questions and this is the evidence I received, and therefore I believe that these people were competent to deliver.
Brilliant. Great, David. We've also had a lot of questions in regards to the person-centered fire risk assessments that we need to look at now from April next year. The main kind of queries coming through is who is actually expected to complete the person-centered fire risk assessment? Is this going to be placed onto the landlord to act? Is it going to be placed on the managing agent? Or do we need to look at hiring external competent fire risk assessments to actually support in completing the person-centered fire risk assessment?
Okay, completing it, the first thing the law requires is that you offer the actual assessment in the first place. That's the first important part, and that is down to the responsible persons, and that's generally going to be agents who are going to be required to offer that particular element. The code of practice makes it very clear that that you have got to be competent to deliver that, and it's worthwhile having a look at that, because it doesn't necessarily mean that you have got to have and be a full fire risk assessor in order to deliver those. It could be that you have the competence, you have the understanding, because of the skills, the knowledge, the experience, and the behaviours that you are exhibiting. So I think I'd be very, very wary to turn around and say, yes, you must use an external advisor every time. I mean, I would love you to be able to do that. Fantastic. Yep. It does help because you're then using somebody that you have checked is competent. But it could be that you believe that you have the competence in order to complete it. The process, in order to meet the requirements, is complicated. It does mean that you've got to understand, really understand how systems operate within your building. But if you have that understanding, and therefore have that competence, then it's perfectly acceptable for others to actually undertake it, not always consultancies.
Great. I think that answers that question perfectly, David. Thank you.
Thank you.
We've also had questions in regards where we're looking in our building, then we're doing type 3s or type 4s, where we're actually accessing the demised areas of the tenants. Would this be sufficient in order to capture the requirements of a person-centered fire risk assessment? Could this be included in the building-wide type 3 or type 4?
That's a good point. Yes. If you are undertaking a person-centered fire risk assessment and going into somebody's flat, what we would be looking at, what any assessor who's doing a person-centered fire risk assessment would be looking at the fire safety systems that are already within a person's domestic premises, as well as the individual, as well as how you manage that whole process. So that would support that type 3 stroke type 4 approach. It probably wouldn't support the type 4 as much, because we would want to be looking at an intrusive element. But yeah, person-centered fire risk assessments, if you were undertaking a number of them within a particular building, that as long as they were then considered as part of your fire risk assessment, that would help, especially a type 3 fire risk assessment.